Welcome to Parsha Panorama for Parshas Lecha. When we finished Parshas Noach, we left off on somewhat of a cliffhanger because we introduced this apparent Plan C that Hashem has now put into place for creation and for mankind, right? Because Plan B was to start the world over from Noach, and hopefully from Noach and on, everything would be hunky-dory, everyone would be doing the right thing, and somehow man would be able to achieve and attain the ultimate good that Hashem created the world for. Right? That was the whole purpose for creation. And since the Dor HaMabul blew it, Hashem started over from Noach. And that was all great until along came the Dor HaFlaga. And in terms of what exactly the problem was with the Dor HaFlaga, we spoke about at length last week, that perhaps it wasn't even a sin at all. Maybe it was just a hashkafa. Maybe it was just a dangerous philosophy. Though, of course, there are sources in Chazal that say that that was a generation of idolaters, that was a certain Avodah Zarah. But even without the understanding of Avodah Zarah, even without the Midrashim and the Midrashic background that references Avodah Zarah, still we were trying to explain exactly what the problem with the Dor HaFlaga was, and of course how Avram Avinu represents a step forward in progress away from the problem that was the Dor HaFlaga. But apparently there was a problem with the Dor HaFlaga, and Avram represents the next step. So the question that we will hopefully deal with today is how exactly that is. How does the world get closer to the tachlis for which Hashem created it through Avraham Avinu? That and other questions we'll address. So in the meantime, let's talk about the global aspect of Parshas Lecha. What in fact is Parshas Lecha about? If Parshas Bereshis was about Hashem's plan A for the world and everything that went wrong with it, right? Hashem created the world and then at the end Hashem said, I'm going to destroy it. And if Parshas Noach was destruction and recreation, right? Plan B, and then everything that went wrong with Plan B. So naturally Parshas Lecha is Plan C. But, of course, we don't see the end of Plan C here, so this is only the beginning, and apparently it's happening through Avraham, but it becomes clear that Avraham takes center stage for a while. He gets at least 2 parshios in full, if you count Chayei Sarah, where he's in the background, and at least in the beginning he's the protagonist. So we're going to get a lot of Avraham. So it sounds like, this is where the world is going. The world is following Avraham Avinu. The Torah is following Avraham Avinu. And what we have to still understand then is, again, how Avraham represents this shift, how Avraham represents this concentration of whatever it is Hashem wants for the world. But also, now that we have multiple parshios about Avraham Avinu, or now that we're about to have them, we need to figure out why exactly there are multiple Avraham Avinu parshios, and what this parsha, in this chapter of Avraham Avinu represents. Right, because Lecha is a pretty lengthy parsha about Avraham. Vayera is a pretty lengthy parsha about Avraham. And what's important to point out is that the Torah and our Masorah, in terms of dividing up the Sidros, is not purely based on what's longer and what's shorter. Right, they're thematic connections. Parshas Naso is also a parsha. It's the longest parsha, and it's parsha of some of topics that are seemingly disjointed. So, and I point that out just so you can understand that we don't necessarily, there is a rhyme and a reason to the way the parshas are divided, and we don't just take length into account. So, that being the case, we have to understand what exactly is Lecha as opposed to Vayera. Okay, so as we try to understand that, let's first establish what we know about Lecha. So Lecha is certainly the beginning of Abraham's mission. We were introduced to Abraham at the end of Noach. we were told very little. We were told about his father Terach. Terach had 3 kids. One of them died. Haran died. And Avraham has a nephew from the son that died. That would be Lot. And Avraham married Sarai. Chazal say that was Yiska. And that was about it. So we know that Sarai is barren. Apparently that we get that point of introduction at least, but we don't really get much more of an introduction. And then Hashem comes to Avraham and he says, okay, let's get going. Lecha, you're going to go. And then Hashem has a bunch of different instructions for Avraham. And it seems like, every step of the way, Hashem has a different instruction for Avraham. So what we know about Lecha, at least, this is the beginning of Avraham's journey. If we know nothing else, that's what we know. This is the beginning of Avraham's journey. And what else is it? So I will already hint at one big difference. If you look, this is important. We spoke about this for Bereshis actually. But look at the beginning of the Parsha, look at the end of the Parsha, and then you'll figure out, what everything in between is. And if you know where the Parsha ends, you can have a little bit of an idea about where Vayera begins. And it's important to point out that Parshas Vayera is not the first Parsha that we actually find the words Vayera in reference to Hashem appearing to Avram. We have it at least a couple of times in Parshas Lecha. So there has to be some shift by the time we get to Vayera. And there is a shift. So while I don't think we have the time to speak about all of it today, what I'll point out is that if you look at the beginning of Lecha and the end of Lecha, and what we get at the beginning of Vayera, you'll notice the shift, and that shift is that just before Lecha closes out, Avram Avinu gets entered into Bris Milah, and that's where he actually becomes Avraham. Right until that point, he was Avram, and Sarah was Sarai. But at the Bris Milah, at the very end of Lecha, that's when Avram becomes Avraham. He experiences his name change. And that is what we close out Lecha with. So, although we really end up having one Avram Parsha, that's Lecha, and this is really maybe an answer to our question why there's more than one Avraham Parsha. There's one Parsha for Avram, one Parsha for Avraham. So there's obviously more that we have to uncover here, right? You can't just say, oh yeah, one is about Avram, one's about Avraham, because after all, he's more or less, he is the same person, but he's the same biological human being. But we have to figure out, so then what exactly is the difference? And it's not just a matter of, okay, yes, it's a different chapter in his life. What is the chapter made of? So, but what we already can start with is that this is Avraham's mission to becoming Avraham. And we'll come back to this very shortly. So let's go through the specifics of the Parsha, and we'll talk about this journey. Right, this is the beginning of Avraham's journey from being Avram to hopefully Avraham by the end of Lecha. And with that, I have 7 sections to the Parsha. Section 1 is the opening, Lech Lecha, Avraham leaving home. At that time he was Avram. Then, number 2, we have as soon as Avraham, or Avram at the time, gets to Eretz Yisrael, so there is a hunger, and then he has to descend to Mitzrayim. And there we have the story of Paro kidnapping Sarai, and then ultimately Hashem plagues him. He finds out that Sarai, in fact, was not Avram's sister, but really his wife, and so he sends him off with gifts. Fine. They come back with the gifts, and they come back home. And Lot was there the entire time. Lot was part of the entourage. In Section 3, Avraham and Lot have to separate because of the scuffle between the shepherds, Avraham's shepherds, Lot's shepherds, Lot's shepherds grazing in places where they shouldn't. And they part ways. Avram says, you choose where you want to go. Lot chooses Sodom. And we're going to hear much more about that in Parshas Vayera. Section 4, we have the war with the kings, which follows right after the separation. So we get a little bit of a history lesson about these kings that there was a big war, the 4 kings versus the 5 kings, and the 4 kings dominated them. And when they did that, Lot got captured, and Avraham went to the war to spare Lot. So that's the war with the kings. That's section 4. 5, we have the bris bein habasarim. Hashem tells Avraham, don't think you lost out on all your merits. You're looking at the stars. Everything's good. You're gonna have so many kids, and he says you're gonna inherit the land. Avraham wants to know, how will I know? And then they have the bris bein habasarim. Avraham separates these animals. There's a fire that goes through. Hashem and Avraham have this bris where Hashem tells Avraham, your children are going to be strangers. They're going to go through oppression, etc., etc. Forewarning, Galus Mitzrayim. Then 6, we have the story of Hagar and baby Ishmael. Right, as soon as Avraham, wakes up from the bris bein habasarim, he ends up in a union with Hagar. Sarai says, I want to be built up, and I don't have kids in the meantime, and so therefore you'll marry her, you'll have a kid, and I'll be built up through that, hopefully. And then 7, we have the bris milah and the name changes. The bris milah name change, where Avraham becomes Avraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, and they're told that you are going to have another kid, and this kid is going to be Yitzchak, and he's going to be the real Zerah Avraham. Right, so those are the 7 sections. I'll just mention them one more time. Number 1, we have the command of Lecha, Avram leaves home. Number 2, we have the hunger, the descent to Mitzrayim, the famine. We have 3, the separation from Lot. Number 4, we have the war with the kings. 5, we have the bris bein habasarim. 6, we have the Hagar and meeting baby Ishmael. Then 7, we have the bris milah and the name changes that take place with that. So now let's go back to the global issues of this Parsha. So there are a handful of questions that we touched on, and let's review them, and we'll add some more as we go along. So one thing that we did not address yet is, why exactly did Hashem choose Avraham? We touched on this somewhat when talking about how Avram apparently represents Plan C. But what we do not get in the beginning of Lecha, at least, or even at the end of Noach, it's not so clear, is why Hashem chooses Avraham. The Torah omits the story of Avram Avinu's incredible exodus from Ur Kasdim, the miracles that the Midrashim quote about Avram escaping a fiery furnace that he was thrown into, all because he believed in God. The whole story with the shattering of the Avodah Zarah statues. So Avram, from the time that we always met him as kids, we learned the Midrashim, and there are different variations of Avraham's past, as recorded in history and recorded in Midrashim, but we know Avraham as starting off as a hero. And you don't get that impression from Lecha. You don't get that impression from Noach. And it begs the question why Avraham doesn't have any semblance of a real introduction, barely gets anything. And so we don't really understand why Hashem chooses Avraham. It's very clear in the Torah why Hashem showed himself in a certain sense. Yeah, we don't have Lashon of Vayir, but he did open up and speak to Noach. And the Torah says, we don't have anything like that for Avraham. We don't have anyone confirming that Avraham is a tzaddik, that Avraham is worthy. It's just Hashem's statement to Avraham. And maybe that's something in and of itself. Maybe the fact that we don't get an explanation, this might speak to those who are darshan leganai for Noach. Right, the fact that it says that Noach was a tzaddik, and particularly in his generation, so maybe that kind of introduction is warranted for someone who you might have otherwise not expected or understood that he was a tzaddik. And those who are darshan leganai, they might say, yeah, because Avraham didn't need such an introduction, because here's a man who needs no introduction because he was as great as he is. And maybe if you consider the audience of the original audience of the Torah, these were people who were alive in the Midbar at Har Sinai. So if they were given this historical account, that they would know their ancestor Avraham, and maybe they wouldn't have known Noach, because in fact Noach is not one of the forefathers. So maybe you could just make the argument that for the audience who received the Torah, Avraham was literally a man who needed no introduction. Maybe. But, for generations, we would like to understand, then if so, What made Avraham, other than the fact that we know that he's our ancestor, what made him the one that Hashem was going to confer upon this responsibility to bear the mission of mankind? Not only that, but the other question is, what exactly was Hashem's plan C? We keep on saying that Avraham is Hashem's plan C for the world. How so? And how would Avraham carry out that plan? Hashem created the world for all of mankind. Alright, so what about Avraham? Avraham he's going to become an Av Hamon Goyim. He's a father to all kinds of nations. But Avraham wasn't the only person. His seed was not the only seed in the world. In fact, at that time he had no seed. He had no kids, except for Ishmael. And there were other nations around him. So Avram becomes this father of nations. In the meantime, he does not really have any nations. There are other nations in the world. And all these Goyim, quote unquote, these people who are, whether they're pagans, idolaters, or just people who are not following Hashem, apparently. So what about them? Is there any hope for them? Hashem says, I'm just going to concentrate on one. If I can't fix the world, I'll just fix one person. Or I'll just follow one person who is doing really well. So what exactly was Hashem's plan C? Hashem created a world for a bunch of people. The world was meant for the entire Earth's population. And with Noah, he destroyed everything. And then he started over. And it wasn't like Hashem killed out the Dor HaFlaga. He let the Dor HaFlaga live. He just dispersed them. Now he says, okay, I'm going to pick one person. And he picks Avraham. But again, why? Why concentrate on one individual? Why give up on the rest of the world? It seems like part of Plan C is to inherently give up on the rest of the world. And then there, of course, there's the other question of why are there two Avram Avinu Parshios? Where's the line between Parshas Lecha and Parshas Vayera? And we defined a line. We said one line might be that the shift from Avram to Avraham. That's the mark of the end of Lecha. Maybe there's truth to that, but why? What exactly is the nature of the shift from Avram to Avraham? And maybe part of it is what we alluded to already earlier, that he becomes an Av Hamon Goyim. That somehow, by becoming an Av Hamon Goyim, this is what gets Hashem to the plan for mankind that he always intended. So let's see what that plan is. The best introduction that we get maybe is Hashem's speech in the opening of Parshas Lecha. Hashem tells Avraham, Lecha, you're going to go for your benefit. That's the classic translation of Lecha. And Hashem tells him all these wonderful things that he's going to get if he goes. You're going to get blessings. You're going to get renown. You're going to have children. A bunch of wonderful things. And these are interesting promises that Hashem makes to Avraham. They all sound very appealing, very enticing, and it's a very fascinating way to start this off. Hashem tells Avram, "You got all these good things coming to you." Now, one thing that I want to point out that might be helpful to understanding, going back to the other question of how did Avraham represent that step of progress away from the Dor HaFlaga. What was wrong with the Dor HaFlaga, and how has Avraham departed from the Dor HaFlaga? So, what I'll say is, again, and the question is, how has Avraham departed from the Dor HaFlaga? And the answer, I think, is just that Avraham had departed from the Dor HaFlaga. Literally, he departed. What was the big problem with the Dor HaFlaga? What was Hashem's major drastic intervention in the Dor HaFlaga? So, if you look in the pasuk, the Torah tells us that that the Dor HaFlaga had an agenda. They wanted to make a name for themselves, Nasa Lanu Shem, and Hashem responded by dispersing them and in creating an inability for them to make a name for themselves. Last week we spoke about the concept of conformity, the concept of the power of man stronger together, the scientific, technological advancements, and how their whole, the whole big plan of mankind was that we can do anything we want as long as we're together. And there's something great about Achdus, but there are weaknesses to things like conformity, groupthink, and lack of true unity. This is a selfish unity where, if I work with you and you work with me, then I'll get what I need out of life. And, if you're a purely righteous person, great. Now, the Dor HaFlaga was not necessarily morally debased. When we said last week that they weren't like the Dor HaMabel, they were religiously debased. They didn't have Yiras Shamayim. Now, they weren't necessarily all bad people. They weren't a society that wasn't able to function, but they could have easily devolved into that. That is because in a world that's governed by morals that are created by man, when everything's a human convention, look what man can do with his intelligence, and when humans work together, so you can become anything you want, and you could change morals. You write the script for life, because again, everything's a human convention. So what did Avraham introduce? At the very least, if we know nothing else, we know that Avraham Avinu introduced dissent. The ability to go against the grain, to go against the crowd, to go against the current, and to follow yourself. And not just your instincts, because human instincts are very fallible, but to follow your best understanding of what is Ratzon Hashem. The following your best understanding, your most humble understanding, intellectually honest understanding of what it is you are supposed to be doing, not what you ought to be doing, and not what is the most popular thing. This is true from the Midrashim. We know this, that Avram was, he was an Ivri. He stood Be'ever Anahar. He stood on the other side of the river, so he knew exactly what he was up against. But you don't only find this from the Midrashim. I think if you look closely, you find this agenda of Avram Avinu in the Psukim. And you find a major contrast, a major departing from the Dor HaFlaga. Let's take a look at a couple of the psukim. So we're already familiar with Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha mi'artzcha u'mi'milatzecha u'mibeis avicha el ha'aretz asher hareka. Hashem says, go from your land, your birthplace, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. This pasuk is actually fraught with its own difficulty, which Be'ezras Hashem will come back to. But he says, I'm going to make you, everything is going to be great for you. V'escha l'goy gadol v'avarecha v'agadla shemecha v'heyei bracha. He says, your name is going to be great. That's very fascinating. Your name is going to be great. Coming off the coattails of the Dor HaFlaga, where the whole goal was Nasa Lanu Shem, right here, right then and there, Hashem is making a promise to Avram that you will have a shame. You will have a name. Very interesting that also although we know that Shem ben Noach, he was righteous, but maybe Shem represents the fault of the generations that followed, the Dor HaFlaga that followed. That was a generation who sought out Shem, and they wanted a name. Hashem said, "Not in your life," and he disperses them, and now he says, "But Abraham, I'm willing to give you a name." Why is Hashem all of a sudden willing to give Avraham a name? And maybe part of what we're supposed to understand is we don't really have the introduction to Avraham. All we there's nowhere where it says, "And I am choosing Avraham," except for right here. And perhaps it's not apparent. We don't have the introduction. We don't have the narration of that decision making, of that declaration. And maybe it's because, unlike Noach, where the Chumash needed to give you the disclaimer, because maybe you otherwise would not have known, because indeed the Torah does not record anything extraordinary about Noach, other than the building of the Teva, which is pretty extraordinary. But up until that point, why he was chosen, there's nothing particularly remarkable about Noach, except maybe the fact that he just was not as debased as the people around him. Because after all, that's why Chazal compare him to the people that he was surrounded by. He was better than them. And maybe he would not have been anything compared to Avraham. So, but what then do we have that speaks about Avraham? We just have his actions. His actions might speak out louder than his words. So let's skip a little bit. Hashem says, "Va'avarecha nivarecha v'mekalecha ha'or v'nivachu b'cha kol mishpachos ha'adama." Here I think we're getting to what is Hashem's plan C for the world. He says that all the families of the world will be blessed through you. And so Rashi quotes a pshat that a person will say, to a son, may you be like Abraham. And, I don't know if anyone has that particular minhag, but maybe this is the answer already. That to think about how Canaan, for example, was cursed by Noach, that he was going to have to serve his brothers. He was going to have to serve his, Cham and Canaan, they'll have to serve Shem and Yefes. So, the beauty of being a servant is that, all your needs are met, but you're subservient. Your needs are met, but through the person to whom you are subordinate. Now, if Avraham represents the seed of Shem, who's going to inherit the world, so everyone theoretically can tap in to the blessings of Avraham. Through Avraham, all the world will be blessed, even if maybe they're not morally fitting for it, but they can be blessed through the bounty of Avraham. In other words, Avraham is the conduit through which the world be blessed. This actually speaks to Hashem's goal for mankind. Hashem wants to give mankind the ultimate good, but of course the ultimate good relies on free choice, and sometimes it's hard for people to make the right choices, and the world is not that righteous after all. But if you have one person through whom everyone else can be blessed, as long as they attach themselves, even if they're not most worthy, but they could still achieve good, so maybe that's the way to get to all of mankind, to bestow goodness upon mankind. Yes, it has to happen through Avraham, but at least everyone has the choice. And, yes, it means being subservient, but after all, attaining the ultimate good does mean being subservient. Even Avraham has to be subservient to Hashem. We're all of the Hashem. But at least now, everyone has the opportunity through Avraham. So we're getting a little bit to what this plan C was. Now, what does Avraham ultimately do? Right? So the Chumash tells us a little bit further. Avraham, we said, he was walking away. He was walking away from other generations, right? The Terach and Avraham started walking away. And then Hashem says to Avraham, Lecha, keep going. This is exactly what I want. Now, one of the big questions on Lecha is the order in which Hashem speaks to Avraham. He says, first leave your land, then your birthplace, then the house of your father. Now that's backwards. Normally, you leave the house, then you leave the birthplace, and then you leave the country. Right, so what exactly is the reason for this? And what exactly does Lech Lecha mean? Go for you, go to you. So I'm going to offer a pshat between Rav Hirsch and the Malbim, who were contemporaries. They both give similar explanations, and they both really work beautifully hand in hand. The Malbim explains that Lech Lecha does not just mean go for your benefit, but it means go to you. Meaning go to your essential self. Sometimes you have to depart from all the things around you to find out who you really are. We often define ourselves by our surroundings, by our upbringing, by the place that we grew up. And certainly these things contribute to our personalities, but our tendencies, our leanings are not actually who we are. They are not our essential self. They are klipos. They are blockage from whom we really are. And what we really are is a holy, pure neshama without any other influences other than the pure will to do Ratzon Hashem. And until you break out of that, you are not listening to your essential self, you're not connecting to your essential self, but you're connecting to everything around you. This was the problem of the Dor HaFlaga. No one was an individual. No one was purely what their inner Ratzon of their heart, their higher Ratzon, was what that was telling them. No one was listening to that. Avraham was the only one to listen to that. And maybe Lech Lecha was a speech that was issued to everybody, but Avraham was the only one that heard it, and the rest of the Dor HaFlaga did not. And that's why Rav Hirsch explains that why is it in backwards order? Because the way you're supposed to think of it is layers, right? There's an outer layer, and then there's the next layer, and then finally you get to the inner layer. So if Avraham is trying to journey to his essential self, which is his connection to Hashem, that means you got to rip off all of the extra layers. Therefore, you got to start from outwards and then go in. What about my country made me who I thought I was? What about my birthplace made me who I thought I was? And what about my household made me who I thought I was? And little by little, you got to rip off those layers. We don't worship, the town we grew up in. Right, but that was the problem of the Dor Haflaga. Avraham is breaking away, and Hashem says, "I'm going to make you a name." And notice what Avraham does right after Hashem appears to him. The pasuk says, "Vayiven sham mizbeach la Hashem anirei lav." And then what does he do? It says, "Vayikra b'shem Hashem." What does Avraham do? He goes around building mizbechos that are each shrines and monuments saying, Hashem was here, not me. The opposite of the Dor Haflaga. Instead of staying in one place and saying, here's my name, Avraham goes from place to place and then is Mekadesh Shem Shemaim. He's Korea b'Shem. That's the essence of an Avraham. That's the opposite of the Dor Haflaga. This is in the plain text of the story, but this is who Avraham was. Now, before we finish, I'll just point out that if you look throughout the story, what Avraham has to keep on doing, this Lecha mission of peeling off the layers and finding out who you are in terms of what is your God-given tafkid, what Hashem wants of you, it doesn't end with Lech Lecha. But throughout the entire journey, Hashem sends Avraham on these twists and turns. He sends him to Eretz Yisrael and he says, okay, well, no, there's a hunger. Avraham has a relationship with Lot, and for spiritual reasons, Lot is holding him down. So Hashem says, that's another layer that you got to peel off. Avraham parts with Lot. Avraham parts with physical wealth in the war with the kings. And Avraham parts with Yishmael. Well, at first, we didn't get to that yet. That's going to be in Parshas Vayera. And then the next layer Avraham peels off is from his own body, his own skin, the bris milah. Avraham is working on peeling these layers until he finds out exactly who he is, and by the time we get to the end, he is the Av Hamon Goyim. He is Avraham. He is his essential self. And I think by the time we get to the end, the Akedah represents the greatest peeling of what's closest to you, your own seed. But the point is that all the twists and turns that Hashem is taking Avraham on, the path to fatherhood, the goal of the whole time is to help Avraham reach his essential self. And when he gets there, he has made it, and he begins Hashem's plan C for mankind. And next week, what we will discuss is what exactly happens from there. What is Vayera about beyond what we saw in Lecha? Well, what kind of addition to this plan does Avraham accomplish? We'll see you next time for Parsha Panorama, for Parshas Vayera.